How much of a man remains when grief has scraped him hollow? The dust of the Chihuahuan high desert knew the answer. It settled on the roof of Elias Thorne's cabin like a second skin, a layer of forgetting that the wind never quite managed to scour away. For 20 years, the dust had been his most constant companion. It coated the two simple wooden crosses on the hill overlooking his homestead, one slightly smaller than the other. It filmed the surface of the water in his well, and clung to the cracked leather of the saddle he no longer used. Elias moved through his life with the economy of a man saving his breath for a conversation that would never come. His days were a silent liturgy of mending what was broken, a fence post splintered by lightning, a loose stone in the hearth, the perpetual wound in his own chest. He had come here after the fever took his Sarah and their boy Jonathan. He'd bought this unforgiving patch of land not to tame it, but to be tamed by it, to let its harshness grind away the man he had been, leaving only this spare, functional shell. The house had 2 chairs at its table. One had not been used in 2 decades. In a small chest, beneath old blankets, lay a hand-carved rocking horse, its paint worn smooth by thumbs that had long since turned to dust themselves. He was checking the line on his northern fence, the wire humming a low, mournful tune in the wind, when he saw them. At first, they were just heat-shimmer apparitions on the horizon, a wavering distortion against the distant mesas. But they did not dissolve. They solidified, taking shape as 5 figures moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm that spoke of exhaustion pushed beyond its limits. As they drew closer, he saw they were women. Apache. Their buckskin dresses were torn and travel-stained, their faces etched with a weariness so profound it seemed ancient. Yet in their eyes, there was a flinty resilience that refused to be extinguished. One woman, older than the rest, was supported by 2 others. Another, younger, walked with a hand pressed to her swollen belly. The one who led them walked with her head high, her gaze fixed on his cabin as if it were a lodestar. Elias remained where he was, a hand resting on a cedar post, his expression unreadable. He was not a man given to surprise, only a deep, abiding stillness. He had heard the whispers in the town of Redemption, the one place he went twice a year for salt, flour, and coffee. Whispers of the government's final push, of soldiers and trackers sweeping the land, rounding up the last free bands, herding them toward the desolation of the reservations. These women were the human consequence of those whispers. They stopped a respectful distance from him. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. It was a language Elias understood. Finally, the leader stepped forward. She was not old, perhaps 30, but her face held the gravity of a matriarch. "We have traveled from the Dragoon Mountains," she said, her voice raspy but clear, English words chosen with care. "They hunt us." She did not need to say who they were. "We ask for sanctuary, water, a place to rest from the sun." She paused, her eyes sweeping over his barren homestead, a place of profound solitude. "We can work. We can mend, cook, clean. We do not ask for charity." Elias's gaze drifted past her to the woman with the child in her womb. He saw Sarah, her own belly round with Jonathan, her face full of a light he could no longer recall without a stab of pain. The ghost of a word formed on his lips. No. It was the only word that had kept him safe. No to neighbors. No to offers of help. No to anything that might breach the walls he had so painstakingly built around his heart. Involvement was a current that could sweep a man away, and he had already drowned once. "There's a pump by the trough," he said, his voice a low gravelly sound, and used to forming sentences. "Take what water you need. There's a road 5 miles south. It leads to Fort Bowie. They'll give you food there." He turned his back on them, a gesture of finality, and began walking toward his cabin, each step an act of will against the pull of their silent desperation. He did not look back. He could feel their eyes on him, a weight heavier than the afternoon sun. He went inside and shut the door, the sound echoing in the empty space. He had done what he could. More than he should have. The world had its own cruel logic. To interfere was to invite chaos. He sat in his chair, staring at the empty one opposite, and waited for the sound of their departure. But the sound never came. As dusk began to purple the edges of the sky, he looked out his window. They had not left. They had gathered under the sparse shade of a lone mesquite tree just off his property, a silent, stubborn vigil. They had built no fire. They sat in a tight circle, a small island of humanity in a vast, indifferent landscape. The pregnant woman was shivering, despite the day's residual heat. A cold knot tightened in Elias's gut. He had offered them the official solution, the fort, knowing full well it was a gateway to a cage. He had seen the reservation at San Carlos once, a place where souls went to wither. He had condemned them with practicality, washed his hands with logic. But their silent refusal to accept his refusal was a judgment. Later that night, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. A storm was brewing. As the first fat drops began to spatter against his roof, a memory broke through his defenses with stunning clarity. Sarah, laughing as she ran inside from a sudden downpour, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes alive with a joy he had thought he'd forgotten forever. The memory broke him. Not with a crash, but with a quiet, inexorable crumbling. He could not leave them out there. His penance had been for his failure to save his own family. What kind of atonement was it if it demanded he sacrifice another? He pulled on his worn coat, lit a lantern, and stepped out into the wind and the rain. The light from his lantern swung wildly, catching the women huddled together, their faces pale and upturned in the darkness. He walked to them, the mud sucking at his boots. He stopped before the leader, whose name he would learn was Nalin. He didn't need to say much. His presence there, in the storm, said it all. "The barn," he rasped, lifting the lantern to indicate the sturdy structure next to the house. "It's dry. There's hay." Nalin searched his face, her dark eyes probing past the weathered exterior, seeking the fissure in his resolve. She found it. With a slow, solemn nod, she helped the elder woman to her feet. Without another word, they followed the small circle of light he cast, moving from the wilderness into the fragile sanctuary he offered. Elias watched them go, feeling the first crack in the frozen wall around his heart. It was a terrifying, exhilarating sensation, like the first breath after being held under water for too long. The barn, long silent but for the rustling of mice, slowly came to life. The 5 women, Nalin the leader, her younger sister Datest who was with child, the elder they called Azusa which meant white stone, and 2 cousins, Elu and Tiny, transformed the space. They were ghosts no more. They moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a life lived in close communion with the earth. They asked for nothing, but their presence was a constant question. Elias kept his distance at first, leaving a pail of fresh milk and a basket of eggs by the barn door each morning. But the strict boundary between house and barn began to blur. One afternoon, he found the handle of his axe, which had been loose for a year, rebound with strips of wet rawhide, tighter and stronger than he could have managed. Another day, the scent of roasting pinyon nuts and wild herbs drifted from their small, smokeless fire, a smell of home that was both comforting and agonizing. Azusa, the elder, was a healer. She would spend hours walking the arid landscape, her keen eyes spotting plants Elias had overlooked for 2 decades. She made a poultice for a cut on his hand that healed in half the time it should have. He accepted it with a stiff nod, the unspoken gratitude a heavy stone in his throat. The true test of his resolve came a week later, in the form of 3 riders. Elias saw the dust cloud long before he heard the jingle of their bridles. He recognized the brand on their horses, the Blackwood Ranch. Silas Blackwood owned half the county, and had his eye on the other half. He was a man who saw the land not as a living thing, but as a series of squares on a map to be acquired, a man for whom progress was a synonym for erasure. His trackers were known for their brutality, especially when it came to clearing the land of its original inhabitants. Elias met them on his porch, his stance deceptively casual, his hands empty. The lead rider, a man with a cruel twist to his lips, spat a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "Thorn!" the man grunted, his eyes scanning the homestead with predatory arrogance. "We're hunting runaways. 5 Apache squaws. Seen 'em?" The lie came easier than Elias expected. It was the first significant lie he had told in 20 years, and it felt like throwing a rock into a still pond. "Haven't seen anyone for weeks," he said, his voice flat. He met the tracker's gaze without flinching. The man narrowed his eyes. "Blackwood's paying a handsome price. They're his problem now. Stole horses, they say." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. "You see anything, you ride to us. Blackwood don't take kindly to folks who shelter vermin." The word vermin hung in the air. Elias felt a cold anger, an emotion he thought had been buried with his family. He just nodded slowly. The riders, unsatisfied but finding no reason for suspicion, turned and rode off. When they were gone, Elias walked to the barn. The women were huddled in the shadows, their faces tight with fear. Nolan met him at the door. "They will be back," she said. It was not a question. "I know," Elias replied. He looked from her face to the others, and finally to D'Auteste, who sat on a pile of hay, her hands protectively cradling her belly. In that moment, the abstract moral dilemma became fiercely personal. This was not about sheltering fugitives. It was about protecting a family. Protecting a child. It was the choice he hadn't been given 20 years ago. "Tonight," he said, his voice imbued with a new authority, "you move into the house." Nolan's eyes widened slightly. "We cannot bring this trouble to your home. It's already here," Elias said. "The barn won't hold against them if they come back to burn it." That night, for the first time in 2 decades, the second chair at Elias's table was occupied. Azusa sat in it, her silent presence filling the room with a strange peace. The other women found spaces on the floor, their quiet breathing a stark contrast to the howling silence Elias was used to. He lay on his cot, staring into the darkness, and felt the house breathing around him. It was no longer a tomb. It was a fortress. The news of Elias's guest spread through Redemption like a grass fire. When he rode into town for supplies, the usual taciturn nods were replaced by averted eyes and suspicious glares. The store owner, a man he'd traded with for years, suddenly found his prices had doubled for Elias. "Supply issues," he mumbled, refusing to meet his eye. Everyone in Redemption owed something to Silas Blackwood, a mortgage, a water rights agreement, a job. Blackwood's displeasure was a financial plague. Finally, Blackwood came himself. He rode a magnificent black stallion and dressed in a tailored suit that was an insult to the dusty landscape. He was flanked by 2 armed men, but he dismounted alone, walking onto Elias's porch as if he owned it. "Thorn," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "We need to have a conversation about civic responsibility." Elias stood in the doorway, blocking the view inside. "This is my land, Blackwood." "Indeed it is." Blackwood smiled, a cold, reptilian expression. "A fine piece of isolation. But isolation doesn't exempt a man from the laws of progress. The government has designated this territory for settlement. The Apache presence is an impediment, a danger. I am merely assisting in the government's noble work." "There are 5 women," Elias said, his voice dangerously low. "One of them is carrying a child." Blackwood waved a dismissive hand. "The gender is irrelevant. Nits make lice. You are harboring fugitives and stolen property. They took horses from one of my outlying camps. It was a lie, and they both knew it. It was the pretext. They had no horses when they arrived here, Elias stated flatly. Blackwood's smile faded. Listen to me, Thorn. I know what you are. A man hiding from a ghost. I admire your commitment to misery. But do not let your personal tragedy interfere with the tide of history. Give them to me. I'll be discreet. No one need know you harbored them this long. Refuse, and I will be forced to see you as an accomplice, an enemy of progress. And this land you hide on will be forfeit. You're not the law, Blackwood. I am the law here. Blackwood corrected him softly. I have the money, the men, and the contracts. The federal marshal in Tucson is an old friend. Don't make me bring him into this. It will be much uglier for everyone. He turned and walked away, leaving his threat to poison the air. Elias knew the confrontation was inevitable. He couldn't outfight Blackwood's men. A gunfight on his porch would be a slaughter, and it would give Blackwood the legal justification he needed. He had to find another way. His mind turned to the only man in redemption not in Blackwood's pocket, Doc Finch, a grizzled, alcoholic sawbones who had served with him at Antietam. They had seen enough of death to last a lifetime and had avoided each other for years, each a reminder of a past the other wanted to forget. He found Finch in his dusty office, smelling of whiskey and regret. Elias, the doctor grunted, surprised. To what do I owe the pleasure? Finally come to have that soul of yours removed? I need your help, Henry, Elias said, cutting straight to the point. He explained the situation, simply and without embellishment. Finch listened, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. When Elias finished, he was silent for a long time. You're asking me to stand against Silas Blackwood. He owns this town. He could ruin me. He will kill them, Henry, Elias said. There's a child about to be born. The doctor looked at his shaking hands. He had patched up men Blackwood's trackers had brutalized. He had set the broken bones of homesteaders Blackwood had forced off their land. He had drowned his conscience in liquor for years. Damn you, Elias, he sighed, downing the whiskey. He looked up, and for the first time, Elias saw the soldier he had known, the man who had run into a hail of bullets to drag a wounded comrade to safety. What do you need me to do? 3 days later, they came. Blackwood, the smirking tracker, a dozen armed men, and a portly man wearing the badge of A.U.S. Marshal. They arrayed themselves in a semicircle in front of Elias's cabin, a line of overwhelming force. Elias stepped onto the porch. He held no rifle. His hands were empty at his sides. Elias Thorn, the marshal called out, his voice puffed with self-importance. I have a warrant for the arrest of 5 Apache fugitives, wanted for horse theft and evading federal authority. Send them out now. They are guests in my home, Elias said, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. They have committed no crime. That is for a judge to decide, the marshal bellowed. You are obstructing justice. I can and will arrest you as well. Blackwood, sitting on his horse, watched with a smug certainty. This was his checkmate. Just then, the sound of a rattling wagon came from the direction of the town. Doc Finch drove the wagon, and sitting beside him, holding a large Bible, was Reverend Miller, a man whose sermons on Christian charity Elias had always ignored. The 2 men represented the only forces in the territory that Blackwood couldn't easily buy or bully, medicine and God. Finch pulled the wagon to a halt between Elias and the posse. He climbed down, carrying his medical bag. Marshal, Finch said, his voice surprisingly steady. I must ask you and your men to stand down. The women inside this house are under my professional medical care. The marshal sputtered. What nonsense is this? Medical care? One of them is in the final stages of a difficult pregnancy. Finch declared, his voice ringing with authority. The others are suffering from severe malnutrition and exhaustion. To move them would endanger their lives, particularly the unborn child. As the only licensed physician in this county, I am officially placing this residence under medical quarantine. It is a matter of public health. Blackwood's face contorted in fury. It was a brilliant, unexpected move. A quarantine was a legal gray area, but one a marshal would be loath to violate, especially with a witness like a preacher present. Reverend Miller stepped forward, his face gentle but firm. Furthermore, Marshal, he said, holding up his Bible, these women have sought sanctuary. My church, and my God, recognize the sanctity of that request. To storm this home would not only be a medical crisis, but a moral one. The marshal looked from the doctor to the preacher, then back to a seething Blackwood. His legal pretext was dissolving. He couldn't open fire on a home under a doctor's quarantine with a preacher standing guard. The political fallout would be disastrous. His authority, and Blackwood's, was built on the illusion of lawful order. This public defiance by two of the town's most respected figures shattered that illusion. This isn't over, Thorne. Blackwood snarled, his voice a low hiss. He wheeled his horse around and, followed by his frustrated posse, rode away in a cloud of impotent dust. The immediate danger had passed. They had won, not with bullets, but with courage, strategy, and the unexpected solidarity of broken men choosing to be whole again. 2 weeks later, in the quiet of Elias's home, Dates gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Azusa acted as midwife, her ancient knowledge filling the room with a calm reverence. Elias stood outside the door, listening to the first cries of a new life, a sound that did not bring pain, but a strange, unclenching peace. He had not saved his own son, but he had helped save this one. The women stayed through the winter, and the small cabin became a home. Laughter, a sound Elias thought he would never hear again, sometimes echoed off the walls. They shared meals, stories, and the quiet work of survival. The house, once a monument to loss, was now a testament to resilience. When spring came, greeting the harsh land, Nolan told Elias it was time for them to leave. There were rumors of a protected territory far to the north, a place they might find lasting peace. Their departure was as quiet and dignified as their arrival. They packed their few belongings, strong and healthy now, ready for the long journey. As they prepared to leave, Nolan held her infant nephew and approached Elias. "He needs a name," she said. "We would be honored if you would give him one." Elias looked at the tiny, perfect child, swaddled in soft buckskin. He thought of Jonathan. The name was a holy, painful thing on his tongue. He could not speak it. Instead, he looked at the rugged peaks of the mountains, which had endured millennia of sun and storm. "In your tongue," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion, "is there a name that means he who endures?" Nolan smiled, a true, brilliant smile. "Teo," she said softly. "His name is Teo." Elias watched them leave, a small band moving toward the sunrise. Dates turned back once and raised a hand. He did not wave back, but stood on his porch until they were just a speck on the horizon. He was alone again, but the silence was different now. It was not an absence, but a presence. It was filled with the echoes of courage and the lingering scent of wood smoke and wild herbs. He walked back into his house. The second chair was empty, but it no longer felt like an accusation. He ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood of the table, his gaze falling upon the 2 crosses on the hill. The grief was still there, a part of his landscape, but it was no longer the only thing. The sun crested the mesas, pouring golden light through the window. It found the cracks in the walls, the marks on the floor, the empty spaces where life had been. And for the first time in 20 years, it filled the house.